Hey guys, what's up? It's Noémi, and today I'm going to be talking about some more of my favorite short stories that I've read recently. If you're new here and you don't really know me, I'm an English major at UCLA in my senior year, and so I do a ton of reading for my college coursework, and I'm taking a creative writing fictional short stories class right now in which we write our own short stories, but we also read a ton of classics by really wonderful authors. And so I wanted to share with you a couple of stories that I've read recently that have been so inspirational for my own writing, and hopefully you can enjoy and read as well. So let's get into it. Okay, so the first story that I want to talk about is called The House with the Mezzanine by Chekhov, and this one is so beautiful. As always, Chekhov has these wonderful landscape descriptions. One line that I really love that I wrote down is, "The shades of evening lay across the flowering rye." And that's just one example out of so many. But we get some of Chekhov's signature feelings of loss of hope by the end of this story. He can often be sort of bleak and depressing, but very beautiful at the same time. The main character is sort of this nihilistic, high-class artist, and he meets a young girl who he bumps up against because she is an activist for the people, and so there's sort of this ideological clash, which is really interesting given the context of Russian politics that Chekhov was writing in. So I think ideologically and theologically, it deals with a lot of really interesting concepts, including spirituality and God, which I really enjoyed, but also, of course, we have Chekhov's beautiful, beautiful descriptions, which is probably my favorite part of reading him. We also read The Darling by Chekhov, which centered on this woman who basically became just like every man she ever loved, including a young boy who she basically adopts. And she doesn't really have any opinions or ideas of her own. She just takes on other people's perspectives. And I thought this one was actually really interesting for the feminist aspect of it, because I read somewhere that Tolstoy characterized the character of the darling as the ideal woman, which, you know, speaks to ideas about what femininity ideally is, at least at this time period. But for me, it felt like Chekhov was criticizing the type of woman who doesn't have her own opinions. So as far as I'm concerned, there was a feminist reading to this story in that Chekhov is critiquing his character rather than venerating her. But it was super interesting, and obviously he is just a master at crafting the short story. I might have mentioned it in one of my previous videos, but Lady with a Lapdog is one of my all-time favorites. Such a classic story. I've yet to read any of his plays, so if you guys have, let me know if they're good. But yeah, Chekhov is wonderful, and I'm so glad I've gotten the opportunity to read him. All right, so next up, we actually have A Real Life by Alice Munro. I've read a few of Alice Munro's short stories now, and I have very mixed feelings about them. The teacher that I've been taking classes with at UCLA, she's a huge Alice Munro fan, and I definitely am a fan of her writing, but I can't say that I really enjoy existing in the worlds that she creates. She creates these bleak landscapes that almost feel sort of hopeless, but she does it in a really, really masterful way. She has this mode of dealing with time and space that feels almost magical. Like, she will start in one place in time, and then you'll forget that that was actually a jump forward into the future or a jump back into the past. And then like 30 pages later, she'll return to that point in time, and you'll realize how she's just sort of bamboozled you. And I think that's really wonderful. Also, I was reading an interview with her for one of my classes, and she said this lovely thing about writing. She said, "I write short stories as if I'm walking through a house." Obviously, I'm paraphrasing, that sounds terrible, but she talked about moving through different rooms and testing out different furniture and different pieces of decoration, as opposed to writing a story with a very linear plot line from beginning to end. She sort of moves about it in a very I guess, non-linear fashion. And I think that really comes across in her writing. It feels like the worlds that she creates are very fully realized. By her, we also read recently a story called Amundsen, which took place in the sort of almost winter wonderland scene in northern Canada. And she often is known for writing about Canada because she herself is Canadian. It's about a woman who goes to a TB clinic, I believe in the 40s, because it was during World War II. And she meets a man and they fall in love, but it's a very non-traditional love story, I suppose, if you even want to call it that. So very well done. Also, her characters are just something else. They're very realistic, but the way that she describes them is anything but cliched. She always is able to pick up the most unassuming details and use them to her advantage. And I so admire her for that. Okay, so another one that we read this year was by John Cheever, which I had never actually read anything else by him, but I've gotten a lot of recommendations to read him, and I finally did, and I loved it. So we read The 548 by him. We also read another that was really short. It's called Reunion. That was only about a page long, and that one was really good too, but it felt a little on the nose for me, I think partially just because the length didn't allow for a lot of nuance. But I loved The 548. It was so complex, and at first, on the surface, it kind of felt like just another predatory story about a man, a villain, who's taking advantage of a woman who turns out to be mentally ill. But there's really so much more going on than that. The man sort of has this very vulnerable moment at the end where he finally sort of feels remorse for what he's done. Yeah, he just has this really lovely moment of self-realization. I don't know if you can give either character moral high ground, but he just has lovely, beautiful prose, but the characters are just amazing. I highly recommend this one. So somebody that I've been really wanting to talk about as well is Joy Williams, because I've listened to over podcast and read several of her stories now, and I've absolutely loved every single one of them. One of my lovely subscribers, shout out to you again, told me to read Train by her, and I thought it was so phenomenal. And then in this class that I'm taking, I also read another by her called Escapes. She is so fantastic. She actually went to the writer's workshop at Iowa with Raymond Carver, and because this is one of her earlier stories, she definitely seems to have been influenced by that minimalist style. So this one is very, very pared down, but still super engaging and compelling. I was reading an interview by her, and when asked how she writes a story, she said, "Sometimes I just start with a metaphor and then circle out from there." She also said, "Good stories are dangerous. A good story produces a subterranean explosion." She is just so wonderful, and I think she uses methods of distortion and displacement a lot in her writing. She basically wants you to feel uncomfortable, which is definitely achieved, but she also has this level of verisimilitude that she's able to capture in her writing that's just amazing. In this story in particular, Escape, there is a mother-daughter sort of dysfunctional dynamic in which the mother, from a child's point of view, is looking for a way to escape, as the title might suggest. And they go to a magic show, and Houdini and his methods of physical escape are mentioned, but I think metaphorically the story goes so much further than that, because it's all about feeling confined in life and wanting to move past your current situation or your current state of mind, but not being able to. So definitely very powerful for me. So a new author for me that I just discovered through this class about 2 weeks ago is Tom Mcguane, and the story we read by him was called Weight Watchers. It's not actually a weight loss story, although on the surface it is pretending to be. He had a very unorthodox structure with his story. It felt sort of like you were being pulled in and then pushed away at the same time, the sort of back and forth tension between what the narrator wanted to let you in on and what he was keeping you as the reader in the dark about, which I thought was really cool. He was working in these very small chunks of scenes, I suppose, but even more than that, images, almost like still images, There's one very memorable one where a husband and wife are being spied on by their young child, and they're in the kitchen, and you are expecting it to be like a sexual encounter or something with the way that the narrators framed it, but it's actually just this very vivid image of the husband licking pie filling off of the mixer that the mother is holding, and the expressions on their faces. It's just so intriguing and wonderful. So he has a very fresh, sort of new take on the short story, which I thought was really fun to dive into. I really loved it. All right, so coming up on our last two, we have Silver Water by Amy Bloom. This one was such a beautiful but horribly sad story about the way a mental illness can affect a family, and I feel like very relatable for anyone, even if you don't necessarily have somebody who's mentally ill close to you. It was so emotionally evocative and deep and funny, and I think humor in the story totally functions in an interesting way, because even though we're laughing at certain points because of how absurd these characters are acting and how ridiculous the scenes may seem, there's also something so real and so heartbreaking about it. I can't quite put it into words, but I'd never read Amy Bloom before, and I was pleasantly surprised by how much I loved this story. Last but not least, I wanted to mention Jamaica Kincaid's story, Girl. This one is really short, so if you have like 5 minutes, you can read it. It's only about a page long, and it's basically one long sentence, maybe not even a sentence technically, but just a string of rebukes that a mother or perhaps a grandmother is telling her daughter. These sort of pieces of advice that she's giving, and it's all in dialogue, we assume. Somehow, in such a tiny, short story, she's able to convey the essences of two very distinct characters and also the context in which they're living in. I mean, the mother is berating the daughter for being a slut, and it's obviously kind of showing this oppressive and patriarchal society that they're living in. Jamaica Kincaid grew up in Antigua, and she didn't come to America until she was a teenager, I believe. This story is basically set in a society like that one we assume, or similar to the one that she grew up in. And there's a lot of cultural references, which I think are really fun to read and interesting for an outsider. That was my list of stories. Hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully you got some recommendations out of it. Let me know if you've read any of these, or if you want to read any of these. I'd love to hear from you. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.